the recording that will go on the internet, hopefully. And I will also share a screen. Okay. Can you see the shared screen? It's a presentation.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
Yes, I can perfectly see that.
Okay, mashallah. So if you, as long as you are able to, I would appreciate if you can keep the cameras on. I'd like to see faces I'm talking, inshallah. So the subject that I suggested for today was what do we mean by modernity and secularity? And that's based on the feedback we received from our prospective participants for this event that's going to take place in Barla in Turkey in the summer, inshallah. They mostly apparently said that they were interested in these subjects, modernity and secularity. And the reason I want to talk about it is these are quite confusing concepts in which there's a lot that has been said, but not much consensus. The meanings can be stretched in multiple ways. Therefore, we need to have a working definition of what these concepts are in order to be able to talk about them and relate other issues to them. So inshallah, the meeting in Barla is going to be about the works of Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, but I'm not going to talk about that at all today. I'm not going to talk even about Islam. I am going to try to come up with a working definition of modernity and secularity. I think the secularity part is going to be a bit more straightforward, but I will start with modernity because that's historically how it appears to have started. Okay, so as I said, when we say modernity, if you ask 50 different scholars, 50 different thinkers about the subject, you'll probably get 50 different answers as to like what it means. Because it is many things put together. It is a whole age in which we are living. Therefore, it appears to be impossible to come up with a definition on which there is consensus. But I think there are at least phenomena that we can identify with modernity and on which we can have consensus. And what I mean by that is what I listed here in these words as mass production, mass transportation, mass media, mass society, mass politics, mass consumption, things that define and inform our lives, becoming mass in scale. So this M-A-S-S, not M-E-S-S, right? So mass or M-E-S-S also comes with it, but what I'm referring to is mass scale things. Now, when I say that, I don't want this to be understood as modernity being only about scale and quantity, because it is not. There are qualitative changes, phenomena that informed and led to this change in scale, and there are qualitative consequences that issue from these changes in scale. But it is more difficult to have consensus about the qualitative factors underlying causes that led to the changes in scale, and it's also difficult to reach consensus about the consequences of these changes in scale, these quantitative changes. Therefore, if we focus on what we can identify tangibly, right? What we can quantify, what we can touch and see and point to, which are these quantitative changes that characterize modernity, we are going to be able to have a more substantive discussion about the subject. So qualitative changes such as what leads to mass production, such as the invention of steam engines, steam power, or later the use of oil engines, or later the use of electricity, and so on and so forth. The invention of telegraph, the invention of railways, the invention of chemical fertilizers, the invention of new print technologies, and so on and so forth. These are all qualitative changes, but they happen in different ways in different places, and also they can change over time. So we start with steam engine, then oil engine, then electrical power. Does it mean that we have modernity at the beginning and something else as these things change? No. We have modernity, and what is constant throughout this is that things become mass in scale. So that is a place to start. I believe that's a place to start talking about modernity. Now, I said these are tangible things that we can pinpoint. And I think looking at a chart like this, the chart of the world population, changing world population in the past 12,000 years, is a very good place to see how there are drastic, tangible changes that we can associate with modernity. As you can see here, the estimate, of course, these are not census results, these are estimates, but the estimate for 10,000 BCE, before Common Era, is 4 million people in the world. And then when we reach the birth of Jesus, alayhi salam, or the beginning of the Common Era, we have something like 200 million people. Now, as we can see here, those 200 million people triple in 1700 years, by year 1700 here. Then, within 1 century, what tripled in 1700 years, within 1 century doubles, reaches 1 billion. And then within another century, it doubles again, reaches 2 billion. But then since that 2 billion in 1930, it has quadrupled within almost a century. So yes, this is only about quantity, but we can easily understand that if there are, say, 100 people in a community, say in a village community, and these 100 people have organized themselves in a certain way, have developed certain kinds of relationships, and that number increases from 100 to 1,000. Obviously, there will have to be new ways of interacting, new ways of organizing society. We can talk about direct democracy in city-states of ancient Greece, for instance. We cannot talk about direct democracy in the world that we live today, with millions and millions of people living together. So this change in population in and of itself is an indication that something new is happening here, or something new should be happening here. Now, 1700, as we can see here, appears to be a turning point in this whole story, and that correlates with what historians have called second agricultural revolution. This happens first in England and then spreads to the rest of the world from there. What we see is a certain mechanization of agriculture, the use of combine machines like these that you see on the screen, metal plows, and so on and so forth, that can till the ground deeper, add some chemical fertilizers to that. You can grow more, harvest faster, and also, again, what comes with mechanization, you can hold what you produce further, which means that an ordinary farmer can take part in a larger economy that goes beyond the village economy, that can integrate into a larger source of income and a larger market. This leads to more food with less labor, which means that these farmers start to have a surplus income. And what that means is, historians have referred to this as the industrious revolution, not industrial revolution, but industrious revolution. What that means is individuals with surplus income were interested in buying things from the market rather than producing it themselves. So instead of carving a spoon, for instance, you want to go to the marketplace and buy a already carved spoon or perhaps even a metal spoon. Instead of weaving your own fabric and sewing a cloth, for instance, you want to go to the market and buy an already sewn or already woven fabric or already sewn outfit. So this interest in purchasing, right, helps the consumption side of what comes next after this, and that is the first industrial revolution. This also goes hand in hand with the with many inventions, especially the steam engine and mechanization of manufacturing, which then leads to industrial production. But in the background, we also have this industrial revolution in which people want to buy what is being produced in that now industrial scale production. So that's the first industrial revolution, and then we will have the second industrial revolution. That will scale this up even further with introduction of electricity and oil, power and so on and so forth, assembly lines. And then there has been several other industrial revolutions or changes in the way industrial production takes place. But I would suggest that these changes, with the possible exception of the past 2 decades with the introduction of the internet and so on and so forth, and what we are going forward with the introduction of artificial intelligence, these more recent changes have not revolutionized the way we live and organize society as much as the first 2 industrial revolutions did. So what are we looking at when we say how the first 2 industrial revolutions revolutionized the way we live, right? Again, as we mentioned before, we are first looking into a change in capacity, right? So, and of course, the industrial revolution first takes place in Europe and spreads to the rest of the world from there. Therefore, these numbers that are taken from Europe, mostly Western Europe, are very indicative of something that is quantitative happening there, which is so large in scale that it cannot not make changes in the qualitative aspects of life, right? So this is a capacity of steam engines in Europe in horsepower. We are looking at 860,000 in 1840, and as you can see here, to 40 million by the end of the century, within about 6 decades, which is a 47-fold increase. So this is an enormous increase in the amount of force that human beings were able to utilize in order to produce things or move things or change things in the world. When I say change things, for instance, you can have a steam-powered machine to dig the soil and dig deeper and mine things that you could not mine before, right? So this is a significant change that we can see, and this is paralleled by, since there is so much force being used, that translates into a lot of production, that stuff that is being produced needs to be utilized in some way. And the way it is being utilized is mostly through the creation of a market in which people are no more living with subsistence level economies, that is what they consume, what they produce, but rather looking to the market through that industrial revolution, as we mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, looking to the market and buying things from the market. And this is then indicated in the amount of exports that we see in the world. And if you take 1800 as the basis, as 100, right, within a century and 13 years, right before World War I, we have a 27-fold increase in the amount of exports that were taking place in the world. And I don't have numbers for this because that would require looking at individual countries individually. But what happens in the internal markets of each country is not too different from this either. It's actually more. We have a even larger increase in the amount of goods that are being exchanged through the market. Again, this is something that amounts to a qualitative change in the way people live their lives. Now, the numbers I gave were from Europe, just to make this even more interesting, or to show that this is something that, yes, started in Europe, but over time changing things in many parts of the world and eventually everywhere in the world. We can look at Japan as an interesting example that is not in Western Europe and North America, but in Asia, but that also borrowed these changes that were invented in Europe and transformed into what we can then define as a modern society. Again, when I say modern, I'm referring to these changes in scale, because the ramifications of that can be different in different places in the world. So in 1868, there was this political transformation in Japan called the Meiji Reformation. They brought the emperor from Kyoto to Tokyo, and they turned Japan into a more centralized empire. And associated with that was a process of reformation that led Japan into borrowing European modernity. So this is what that means. We showed numbers in Europe. This is what that means in the case of Japan. Remember, the beginning point is 1868. In 1875, we see that Japan was producing 600,000 metric tons of coal. By 1913, we reached 21 million. So this is mostly steam power, right? They are not just heating their houses with this coal. They are using steam-powered ships, steam-powered machines, steam-powered railways, and so on and so forth. They are using an enormous amount of force to produce an enormous amount of stuff and then consume it. So steamships, 1873, they have 26. 1913, they have 1,514. Railways, in 1872, they have 18 miles of railways. By 1914, they have 7,100 miles of railways, right? So you need to imagine the amount of goods and people that moved places with 71,000 miles of railway tracks in Japan. This amounts again to a qualitative change in the way people lived. Another example from Russia. This is a map of Russia's railways in 1870, and the whole railway construction in Russia starts after 1849, so the second half of the 19th century, and you can see that within 20 years or so, they connect some of the major centers of European Russia, and this is confined to European Russia. We are not going to have anything significant in Asian Russia until much later. We'll have the Trans-Siberian Railway going as a single line from European Russia all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and a few other railway lines around the Caspian Sea. But primarily in European Russia, this is 1870, again, they connected some of the main centers of the empire in European parts of the empire. But look at this now. This is 1914. After something like 45 years, what you can see is that those few railway lines turn into a web, a spider web that connects not only major cities and centers, but even smaller towns. What that means is those smaller towns and the villages that surrounded those smaller towns all become integrated in a global or first imperial economy, which then, it's not on the map, but which then connects to a global economy, because the city of Odessa here becomes a major port of exporting grains that were produced primarily in southern Russia, and southern Russia, which is Ukraine today, of course, comes to be known as the breadbasket of Europe. The grains that were produced here were being sold in Europe. So what that means? That means if you're a farmer living in this region, you are not concerned about only producing, some vegetables and some grain and perhaps some fodder for your animals. That's going to be enough for you for that given year, and not worry about the rest. But rather you will focus on global grain prices and how much money you can make from producing wheat versus producing sunflower seeds versus producing corn, and so on and so forth. And you will be worrying about producing as much of one of those things as possible and selling that and having money in your pocket. And once you have money in your pocket, you will be interested in going to the marketplace and buying things. Now, whatever is available in the marketplace, that may be new rubber shoes, that may be, as you move later in the 19th century, gramophones that you can use to listen to music recorded in Vienna. The sky is the limit. When people invent things, when people produce things, there is a market for that. Now, there's money, there's a consumption side, and there's demand, and there is a market for it. Okay, so these are other numbers that should really, make this more concrete in our minds. We went through the numbers for Japan. Now, the numbers for Russia. Russia has 720 miles in 1857 of railways. By the time you reach 1914, that reaches to 44,000 miles. Russia holds 14 million tons of freight in 1874. That reaches 244 million in 1913. So enormous amount, an enormous scale of increase in the amount of things people produce and consume. And this is also correlated by that enormous hike in population, which I showed earlier on. Water transportation in 1861, Russia has 6 million tons of freight being hauled on water. By 1913, that reaches to 60 million tons, so a tenfold increase in water transportation. In 1896, Russia has a postal service at the beginning of the 19th century, but it was mostly and only for government purposes. In time, it was open to private use, and private postal offices were opened in many small towns and so on and so forth. By 1896, therefore, you reach to 593 million pieces of mail that's being shipped from near zero at the beginning of the 19th century. But by 1903, so that is how many years? Like 7 years. In 7 years, the number of pieces, the amount of pieces of mail that's being shipped in Russia doubles. And then within 10 years, it doubles again. You reach 2.2 billion in 1913. Now, we mentioned mass media at the beginning of the lecture. That includes print media, obviously. They did not have radio and TV yet. But by 1910, we see 425 million pieces of periodicals being delivered through postal services in the Russian Empire. So what that means is, forget about what is being sold in kiosks and shops and so on and so forth, right? That is also a phenomenon. There are probably even more that is being purchased. But even if you focus only the periodicals that are being distributed to homes, we are thinking about a population of about 150 million. That means about 3 periodicals per person in the empire. This is an enormous qualitative change in the way people live their lives, because for millennia, people received information about the rest of the world from travelers, occasional travelers. In some parts of the world, a traveler may not be coming to your village from a distant place. Next village, yes, but from a distant place, maybe once in a year, more than once in a year, right? Now you are receiving a constant flow of news and information and other things about the rest of the world. Telegraph lines, 11,000 miles in 1860 to 164,000 miles in 1910, and 50 million telegraphs were sent in 1910. Now, when we say telegraph, don't just think about people, sending quick messages to each other. This is one of the things that made the creation of large financial institutions possible. Earlier, the way banking happened was, say, there would be, wealthy families located in multiple places around the world or in a geography. Here we are speaking about Russia, say one in Moscow, a wealthy family with members in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And if you need to transfer money to St. Petersburg, usually you would just pack your money and go and pray that you would not be robbed on the way. But another way was you would go to the member of this family in Moscow, give the money to this person, get a note saying that you gave the money, a sealed note, and then you would go to St. Petersburg and claim the money from another member of this family there. This is how it happened around the world. But now, with the invention of telegraph, small operations like this can turn into huge financial institutions, because you don't need to take that note and go to St. Petersburg. They can just telegraph from St. Petersburg the numbers that they have, from Moscow the numbers that they have, and the office in St. Petersburg will have that. So we have the introduction of modern banking, modern insurance services, and also this contributes tremendously to long distance commerce, because now you don't need to go to a place in order to purchase things. You can print catalogs, send those catalogs to your consumers. Your consumers can look at the catalog, mark what they want, mail it back to you, or telegraph what they need, and then they can pay through these financial institutions. Right? So these are unprecedented changes, again, in the way people are living. We already looked at that. Okay. So I'm hoping that these numbers will make what I mean by things becoming mass, right? The quantitative changes that characterize, that define life. But once again, this does not only mean, people just produced more, just consumed more. It's all about numbers. No, this amounts to a systemic change, right? The drastic hikes in scale are caused by and result in qualitative transformations. I'm not focusing on those qualitative transformations once again, because these are difficult to explain in a coherent way in which everybody will have consensus. The causes shift in time. We start with steam engines, and then we move to oil, we move to electricity. We start with telegraph, and then we move to something else, and then we move to the internet. Or in terms of the consequences, the changes in culture, all of this leads to, say, in Europe, are not the same that we see in Japan. Therefore, the consequences can be different. But all things put, what we see is a tangible change. There is something called modernity. This is not a fiction of imagination. This is not just an intellectual proposition. This is a tangible reality that that has been defining life since around the mid-18th century. Not everywhere. When I say mid-18th century, I mean primarily England, but by the turn of the 20th century, this is something that spreads to most parts of the world through colonization. In the course of the 20th century and today, it is something that defines life everywhere in the world. So it is something that we cannot avoid. Now, that is an important proposition, that we cannot avoid it, because I think Brother Said from Algeria joined, because I don't like, I would appreciate if people can turn their cameras on if you are able to. That way I could know who is here, but I think I saw Brother Said joining from Algeria. But anyway, if he is here, he can.
Hocam başka
Yeah.
kardeşler de var. Bilmiyorum başta tanışma yapmış mıydınız ama sonrasında yapabiliriz isterseniz.
Sister Tuba is saying that we can have introductions. Since I started the lecture, 10 minutes into the meeting, I'm not going to do that now. At the end, inshallah, we can try it. But anyway, if Brother Said is here, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's this quote that is attributed to the famous Algerian Sheikh Al-Alawi, Ahmed Al-Alawi. Apparently, he said that the best thing you can do about modernity is to ignore it. Now, in an ideal world, I would say, yeah, that would be good, right? But it would be nice to live in our villages and happily ever after. But modernity is not something that you can possibly ignore. It's going to catch up with you. It is like the proposing for the fish to say, ignore water, or for human beings to say, ignore air, right? It is everywhere, defining life everywhere. It's not ignorable. Therefore, we have to account for it. We have to understand it. We have to work our ways through it. We have to think about how we can maintain the kinds of lives that we want to live as things have transformed qualitatively and quantitatively so drastically in our world. So we cannot ignore it. And when I say this, I don't only mean the values and value systems that have come from where all this started in Western Europe, right? Modernity started with Western Europe. It reached an enormous quantity that was drastic and irresistible. It showed itself at the gates of other countries, places in the world as colonization, or if there were parts of the world where communities were not colonized, they saw this drastic power in the hands of Western Europeans, and they felt that they had to catch up. Therefore, there was this what I call emulative pressure. They wanted to catch up. They wanted to be like that, and therefore they wanted to borrow. And because it started in Western Europe, it was embedded in a web of matrix of values and ideas and arguments and theories and cultural manifestations. And whoever borrowed them along with those material changes in life tended to borrow the intellectual, moral propositions that informed or gave shape, they gave content to those changes in form, right? So this is an example. As I mentioned, there was a reformation or a coup in 1868 in Japan, and the new Japanese administration decided to borrow European and North American at this time technologies and systems of government and so on and so forth. And together with that, they also borrowed West European and North American ways of living. There was a rebellion in Japan in 1877, after 9 years after that Meiji Reformation, in which what you can think of as the conservative elements of society wanted to undo what had started to happen in Japan, and they were defeated for predictable reasons. They were fighting it with swords, and the other side had by this point trained in West European means of warfare or ways of warfare. They were defeated, and this is a picture that shows how the conservative elements that were defeated are humiliated in front of the new officers of the new Japanese army. And you can see that the new Japanese soldiers are dressed in European style uniforms, while the old ones are dressed in their traditional clothing. So the reason I'm showing this picture again is this was not all these changes in scale and form in material aspects of life were not independent from cultural ramifications. In addition to the qualitative changes that they occasion, those material changes and changes in scale occasion regardless of the cultural input, but they also came with a cultural input, and that also has to be accounted for. That's also something that we cannot ignore. Another picture, this is emperor and court lady, etc. As you can see, they are all dressed up in European style clothing. So some of the changes that result from these quantitative transformations. First, population increase. When you have more food, you have more people. When you have antibiotics, less people die. When you learn about microbes and hygiene, babies can survive more, right? Population increase, tremendous population increase, as I showed at the beginning of the class, an eightfold increase. A fourfold increase from the beginning of the century. Now, another thing that's really, really important is urbanization. When you produce in such large scale, you cannot do that in a scattered way in small, operations in villages and distant places. What you produce needs to be whole, and the input, the material, and the energy for that also needs to be whole or concentrated. And also the people who are producing this need to be concentrated. What this means is urbanization in the world. I'm going to talk about that in more detail, therefore I'm just moving on. Significant improvements in the standards of living, which serves as a very powerful lure for other people, for people, because now you can eat more, therefore this is something good. Now you can have more clothing, therefore this is something good. Now you can have better healthcare, therefore this is something good, right? So the quantitative changes start to be associated in people's lives as something positive. And then anything that comes with it can also be associated with things positive. Shifts in relationships between classes and occupations. Before it was mostly peasants. And in Europe you had feudal lords, not only in Europe, but things similar to feudal lords in other parts of the world, in China, in the Ottoman Empire, etc. That changes. Now you have workers, factory owners, bureaucrats, the aristocracy starts to diminish, the number of peasants starts to diminish. So the types of people that fill in that large population is changing. Now, popularization of education. This did not have to happen, but the quantitative changes made it possible and also made it look necessary. What we mean by the changes in the quantitative changes making it possible, for popularization of education, you need schools. To build schools, you need money. For that money, you need surplus. Surplus money comes from industrialization or the industrialist revolution. For popularization of education, you need books. That means mass print. Popularization of education requires large-scale organization of humans. For that, you need new kinds of governments, so on and so forth. In the 18th century, the standard was for individuals to pursue education on their own, with their own means, and in their own ways, right? But today, as you can all see around the world, education is mostly a government-regulated and in many cases mandated task for individuals to fulfill. Police state. So what I mean here is not police as security forces, but rather police as city, from the Greek word, police state. Remember, we mentioned urbanization. When cities are becoming a really prominent phenomenon and really large numbers are concentrating in cities, that large number of people had to be regulated. From this need for regulation, there emerged first at the city level governments that fulfilled many functions that just were not needed or were not fulfilled by a higher organization before, such as sewerage systems, city water, later on electricity, the construction of roads, the preservation of security in the city, the lighting of streets, and so on and so forth. So these functions that now became associated with a higher organization leads to the really powerful and in many ways problematic modern state. Now, because the modern state affects the lives of each and every individual so deeply, each and every individual starts to become concerned with who is in charge and how it is being operated. That leads to mass politics. Those masses are now starting to enter politics. Economic and social reforms, now that the masses enter politics and problems also take a mass scale, society-wide scale, policies that are going to affect entire societies become indispensable. Again, something that leads to the emergence and functioning of the modern state. Now, in there, we also have imperialist, nationalist, ideological competitions. When politics become mass, the consequences of politics also become mass and large scale. I mean, we have in our minds, say, the hordes of Genghis Khan in the early 13th century and how much destruction they caused and so on and so forth. And that is true by the standards of the time that they lived. But if you were to put the amount of destruction that these huge, notorious armies of the world in history were able to cause, if you were to compare that with the kinds of destruction that human beings have caused on other human beings in the 20th century or 19th century, but also especially 20th century, it dwarfs whatever came before. World War II, we are talking about upwards of 60 million people dying, right? What happens in Gaza today, as we can see, enormous amount of violence being used between enormously powerful entities that we now call states. Technology revolutionizes the methods of warfare. We talked about the growth of global finance institutions. Cash crops leads to marketization of agriculture, and so on and so forth. So this is not a complete list, but this is a list that should give us ideas about what kinds of changes we are thinking about when we talk about modernity. Now, we mentioned urbanization. This is a chart that shows the ratio of urban versus rural populations in the world. Here you can see that this is 1800. You can see that there's an insignificant amount of urban population, but when we reach the contemporary era, it is almost half and half around the world. In developed countries, this is going to be even more drastic. It's going to be 80 to 20 or something like that. So world population increased tremendously. As world population increased tremendously, half of that tremendous amount moved to cities. Again, this is a very conspicuous qualitative change in the way people lived. We now, or most of the world population now live in cities, and city life has implications that are very different from rural life. This is another chart that's same information, how the ratio of city population increased compared to the total population after 1800. Okay, so what kinds of differences are we talking about, like what defines our lives in the cities as urban human beings now. And I mean, rural areas are not completely free from what we are talking about here, especially after after the 1990s with the introduction of internet and social media and so on and so forth. But this will give us an idea, right? Before we had villages, and villages had communities that lived together for decades, if not centuries. You knew who the next neighbor was, who the next neighbor's father was, the grandfather was, grandmother was, and so on and so forth. You were probably related distantly as relatives. You shared stories, and the community itself gave meaning to people's lives. You know, we don't have time for it now, but Tolstoy, the great Russian author Tolstoy, for instance, talks about this and suggesting that being a part of that community was in and of itself a source of fulfillment for people. And when death approached, they did not look into death as a complete vacuum, but rather something that they would easily leave behind, because the community that gave meaning to their lives would continue. It also meant that the traditions, customs of that community, you socialized into the traditions and customs of that community, and without questioning, you took pleasure in continuing those traditions and customs. And religion was a part of this. As I said, I'm not going to talk about Islam or Nursi today, but we should, put a mark here, right? The religion was a very important part of that village or tribal, in some cases, life that helped people to take religion for granted and internalize as their own, versus the cities where individuals become just one among thousands, sometimes millions, faceless, imposes a huge amount of anonymity, because very few people know you, and those people that probably are working at the factory during the day and coming home tired, and you see them perhaps once a month, once a week, but there is no day-to-day continuous interaction. Therefore, the things that you do, the things that you think, become your own concern only. Individuals, as opposed to communities, start to define societies. And that's a very dangerous place to be. Again, if you think about religion in this context, that's a very dangerous place to be, because you are left alone with your lower self, lower soul, with your nafs. It's you and your nafs in many cases. The internet will make this worse. You can be alone, not in the, you can be alone in your family, in your room too. Now, okay. Before people could identify with their crafts, right? You are a shoemaker, you identify with your craft. You're a housewife. You're a woman who stays home. You can identify with the food that you make, and that could give you a sense of fulfillment in life. Whereas in the urban ways of production, individuals are, this is a Marxist concept, by the way, individuals are alienated from what they produce. It just becomes a thing that you have no connection with, and that does not give you fulfillment. You spend, earlier on, you start from 12 hours, 10 hours, then to 8 hours in a factory shop doing something, and that means nothing to you other than the amount of money that you are possibly going to get at the end of the week or the month, right? So there's no sense of fulfillment here. You need to look for other things for a sense of fulfillment. Now, we did not talk about science, but of course, science is also a very important institution that underlies all these things, because all those technological changes are products of science. And a really important concept that is introduced to us by Max Weber is disenchantment, right? So the idea that materialist science offers or will offer an explanation and solution for everything in the world, that is disenchantment. Because earlier, the world was filled with mysteries. The sun is rising. Why is it rising? The moon changes phases. Why is it changing phases? It rained this year a lot. We have produced. It didn't year last year. There was drought. Like, why are all these things happening? We did not have explanations of how. Now, we do not have the explanations of why based on science still, but we do not have explanations of how either. Right? Science offers explanations of how, and that makes it feel like the mystery is resolved. There is no mystery anymore. The enchantment is gone. This is the disenchantment of the world. Now, are there things that science don't explain? Yes, but the proposition is that because it has explained so much, it will explain what is to come too. We just need to wait, right? So this creates an intellectual environment where metaphysical considerations become irrelevant, supposedly become irrelevant, and the promise becomes that rationalization, that is, all these explanations of how, will deliver a better future, right? So anonymity, that takes away the internalization of values, community values. Disenchantment, that promises a better life without those values, right? That leads to what we then will identify as secularity, not secularism, not we are not talking about the political ideology about the separation of religious institutions and state, but secularity as a way of life, as a mode of life that defines life in modern context. And what we mean by that is, because of the anonymity, because of the disappearance of communities, because of the disenchantment of the world, and so on and so forth, belief in God or metaphysical reality ceases to be taken for granted in this context. Irreligiosity or religion without structure, right, becomes a choice that everyone can make individually on their own. And it does not only become a neutral choice. In many cases, actually, it is easier, right? Irreligiosity or religion without structure becomes the easier choice. Many of you here are scholars, scientists. If you go to an average modern university, go to a science department, you are supposed to put your values at the door and walk, or your religious values, your metaphysical values, and so on and so forth, at the door and move in neutrally. But that's not a possibility, because the supposition of the absence of anything beyond the mechanical interaction of things, right? That the metaphysical does not have an impact on the physical in and of itself is a value, a belief system, right? So therefore, irreligiosity or religion without structure becomes the easier choice in this modern secular context. All right. Now, we talked about the creation of the modern state and how powerful and drastic a cause of change that is in people's lives. That's because instead of the internalization of community in village communities before, now we have, through popular education, through other things that I'm going to list there, or you can see on the screen, what we have is the subjectification of individuals. The whole machinery of modernity, with states and corporations and big factories and so on and so forth, needs certain kinds of individuals. And it prepares the means for the molding of, shaping of those individuals. Modern individuals have to produce, reproduce, and consume in certain ways for this whole machinery to continue to function. So two big forces manage and make this possible. And one of them is the state, through schooling, policing, military service, legislation, political process, and so on and so forth. It does that. And the other is the market, and that does the same through, and they work in tandem, right? They work together, the state and the market work together through employment, entertainment, schooling, and advertisement. So we are facing a you know, a colossal animal like Habermas's Leviathan, right? So the Leviathan is not only the state, but this whole modern machinery. We are facing a Leviathan that, once again, we cannot just ignore. We have to deal with it. And we, you know, as individuals, we look dwarfed. We look impoverished and very weak, so weak. But there are ways to come out of this, and that's hopefully what we will be thinking about, talking about until we meet in Barla and in Barla too. Okay. I'm close to the end. Meaning of modern secularity in institutional sense. This is not only about values. Again, you know, because some people talk about these issues in a very intellectual way, very smart way, in a lot of detail. They are going to identify all the problems in the values or lack of values that are associated with modernity. And the implication of that appears to be that once you shift values, once you change the way you are thinking, once you change what's in your mind, the solution will just come. But that is not the case, because this is not only about meanings. This is not only about ideas and imaginations. This has a very concrete, structural, institutional foundation, and we cannot undo or redo what has happened unless we take those structural institutional foundations into account too, right? So some examples of what I mean by that, but this is definitely not a exhaustive account, right? The state is sovereign, right? This is an institutionalized concept. It does not want to be restricted by metaphysical principles or considerations. Morality and religion is relegated to a secondary position as a result, in order to preserve the sovereignty of the state. The state can kill people, open war, as long as it is done in the name of the state. It's okay, right? I'm not saying that it's okay, but this is what it comes to in the modern context. And regardless of whether the state is moral or not, loyalty and service to the secular state becomes prioritized in people's lives. Schooling, military service, legislation, political process, all those things that I mentioned here, or the market, employment, entertainment, schooling, advertisement, ingrain this in our minds, and it becomes very difficult, almost impossible to get out of it. Then the state is sovereign and preserves it's geared to preserve its sovereignty, and the market is profit-oriented. It's geared to preserve its profit orientation. And again, it does not want to be restricted by metaphysical principles or considerations. Morality and religion is relegated to a secondary position for the market, and contribution to profit maximization is prioritized over the kinds of things that we would want to prioritize if we want religion, if we want morality, if we want metaphysical values in our lives. So this comes with a rationalization, power or profit-oriented decision-making, not compassion, for instance, not justice, for instance, right? Now, this then puts us in this bind in which, if you want a values-based life, if you want religion as Muslims, if you want Islam to define our lives and the lives of the community and so on and so forth, you know, we face certain contradictions that we have to account for. We cannot just ignore, right? Religion prioritizes metaphysical principles and considerations. You know, it prioritizes values and tradition over interests and fashion. It prioritizes rights and compassion over power and profit. The modern state, the modern market forces do just the opposite. So what do we do? How do we get out of this? Say we want to change things. Again, what I'm trying to emphasize, or what I want to emphasize, is that this would not and cannot happen just by us shifting our minds, just by introducing new values, because the problem is systemic and the system has structures. And as long as those structures are not fixed, they are going to come back and haunt us, and they are going to dwarf and silence us. So some examples of the systemic problems. The world is filled with inequalities. So this is, 1% controls 46% of the world's values. People crowded on one part of the earth, and people are living their lives in the other part of the earth. This is reality. This is a reality that we are all facing, right? This part of the world has enormous power, and the people in this part of the world don't have that power. That's as clear as day. Share of world GDP, this is an example, right? So this is Western Europe, this is USA by the 1950s, and this is the Middle East, where it stays, right? The amount of resources that you can use in order to achieve a task directly translates into the consequences that you can possibly achieve. Now, of course, we believe in God being all-powerful, right? Of course, we believe in sincerity being an irresistible force beyond all these material circumstances, right? But we also live in a world in that God created with certain patterns and regularities. So we live in a world of means. We live in a world of wisdom. And these are things that we can talk more in Barla, inshallah. Therefore, while that ultimately is the truth, right? God is overpowered. God's al-Qahhar, right? While the ultimate impact and effect of metaphysical reality is supreme, right? As individuals living in this world, we have to follow the rules of this world. And according to the rules of this world, this is the reality. This is the amount of resources we have, right? This is another chart. I'm just putting these charts one after the other in order to, drive this home. This is Britain. Black is Britain in terms of income by 1950. Red is China. Purple or pink is India, right? This is China and India. Now, after 1950, China will change. China will grow, right? But not the Middle East. This was per capita, per individual income. This is total GDP of the world. If you were to look for Muslim countries here, right, they are almost invisible. Here is Turkey, United Arab Emirates. I can't read this. My eyes don't see that well. But this is United States. This is China. This is Japan. This is Europe, Western Europe, right? These have meanings. These are things that we cannot ignore. These are things that we have to take into consideration. Say we want to change things, but how do we and how can we change things? We cannot do it without thinking about these. This is current GDP per capita, $54,800 in the United States. Let's see, 3,500 in Algeria, in North Africa, right? 3,400 in Indonesia and Malaysia. Turkey had reached 10,000, but it's not there any longer, right? These numbers are old. These all have meanings. We have to understand and account for all these structures and institutions, all these foundations when we think about modernity and how we can deal with it. All right. I don't know how long I went. Okay, so I went more than 2 hours. Sorry about that. Or did I? No, I didn't go for more than 2 hours. It's only an hour and 10 minutes. No, I did quite well. Okay. We still have about 20 minutes that we can use for discussion and introductions. I'm going to stop share so we can see each other. I would once again ask that everybody turn their cameras on if you are able to, unless technology prevents you from doing so, because it's much better when we can see each other. I will also stop recording because I want people to feel comfortable about what they say.